The most fundamental life skill for children is the ability to communicate. It directly impacts on their ability to learn, to develop friendships, and on their life chances. Getting communication right, meaning speech and language development, starting from birth, and there are huge benefits, not just to the individual, but to society and to the economy as a whole. Yet, despite the best efforts of so many involved in supporting children and young people, and some tremendous individual projects and programmes, the work of the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and I welcome them here today, many of them, the Communication Champion Jean Goss, the Communication Council, the charity ICANN, and many more, including individual teachers and early years staff, awareness of the importance of children and young people's speech and language and communication amongst the public and decision makers still seems to be sadly lacking. And as a consequence, there are some serious impacts on both individuals and society. Hence, Madam Chairman, today's debate. And here I must mention my right honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, the member for Buckingham. He must be commended for his dedicated interest in this area, and the report, the Bercow report, carried out 10 years ago, was a seminal piece of work in this area. It was an independent review of the state of provision for children with speech, language and communication needs, SLCN, and I might refer to it as that as I go along because it is a bit of a mouthful. Much good work flowed from this excellent report, including the Better Communication Research Programme and the Communications Champion that I've mentioned previously. But however, recently the follow-up report, Bercow 10 years on, published by ICANN, the Children's Communication Charity, and the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists in March this year, and launched in style in Speaker's House, with the Minister himself in attendance, I'm very pleased to say. This document reveals that, despite these pockets of great achievement, not enough progress has been made, and that this really is a Cinderella sector. I surmise at this juncture that this may be closely linked to the fact that this whole area seems to fall between two stools, that of health and education, and somehow it fails to be allotted the place I believe it deserves in the national policy of this country. This second report highlights that as a nation we have yet to grasp the significance that not focusing fully on the importance of speech, language and communication has on young generations and therefore society as a whole. As a result, thousands of children and families are suffering needlessly. Evidence gathered to put together in this report, that was thousands of contributors, concluded that 1.4 million children and young people in the UK have speech, language and communication needs. That's 10% of children, Madam Chairman. And of these, 7.6% have something called developmental language disorder. Now, this is a condition where children have problems understanding and or using spoken language, and there's no obvious reason for these difficulties. No hearing problem and no physical disability explains them. The rest, i.e. making up the 10%, have language disorders associated with other conditions, such as autism or hearing impairment, plus other difficulties including stammering, and I am not addressing these today. This debate really concentrates on that 7.6% with developmental language disorder. Left untreated, this will affect them for the rest of their lives adversely. Madam Chairman, you might be wondering why I'm interested in this area in particular. A raft of reasons. Much of my career was as a journalist and a broadcaster, so communication has been a crucial part of my world, and I really appreciate how important it is. But also I ran a small business, and even as MPs we're employees, and it might seem a simple thing, but what is key as an employee when you're looking to take on someone into most of our roles? Well, it's someone who can communicate. Be pleasant, amenable, good with words, able to converse and write clearly. Yes, speech, language and communication skills are essential in our world. But most importantly, I'm interested in this as a parent. I brought up 3 children with my husband, Charles, who I hope might be listening. So I'm aware that it's parents themselves that can make a real contribution to helping their children develop their communication skills. But more of that later.
I'm ready to give way.
Of course I'll give way to
Most
my honourable friend.
She's making an extremely powerful speech on a very interesting topic. Just picking up on the point she's saying about the value of communication in all professions, one as we shouldn't forget is teachers and their ability to be trained and voice coaching. There's two Essex MATs who've invested heavily in voice coaching and voice training for their teachers. And they've got a much enhanced retention rate, 90% retention, ensuring that teachers are actually themselves educated and coached and assisted. That I think does help retention, as well as giving a powerful example for the children in their care.
I very much thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I'm actually going to come on to talk about teachers and their role, things they've noticed, but also how we might help them, because it's such an important point. And the voice coaching is really, I'm very interested in those projects in particular. So thank you very much. And I mentioned earlier the detrimental effect on children that poor communication skills can have. So children affected can do less well at school. From the get-go, they make less academic progress in the early years foundation stage than their contemporaries. And when they leave primary school, their attainment in reading, writing and mathematics is much lower than those without speech and language and communication issues. Only 50% of those identified, this was in the report, reached the expected standards of those surveyed at this stage. Progress this on, though, and not surprisingly, at GCSE level, these children are also affected, with only 20.3% of SLCN children gaining the grade 4 or C or above in English, Maths and GCSE, compared to an expected 63.9%. So you can notice how this is affecting them, and a pattern is clear. This poor SLCN attainment is going to directly affect their academic progress. But on top of this, there is a high chance that these children will also, unfortunately, develop mental health issues. In fact, young people referred to mental health services are 3 times more likely to have SLCN than they would do otherwise. And then there's also a strong correlation between emotional and behavioural disorders and language difficulties. Of course I'll give way.
And I thank the Honourable Member for giving way and for her leadership here. It's great that she's helped initiate this debate this morning. Does she agree with me that the report's recommendations on youth justice are really important, and that it's clear that speech and language therapists can play a big part in reducing the risk of reoffending? So does she agree with me that it's important that these services are provided as early as possible to young people who are in the youth justice system?
Again, I thank the Honourable Member very much for that intervention. I know it's something the member is particularly interested in, and he makes a very valid point, which again I'm definitely going to come on to, because it all links up in the case I hope I'm going to make today. So the things I've mentioned so far all affect children's life chances, and it is borne out exactly as my honourable friend says, because 60% of young offenders have unidentified speech, language and communication projects. I mean, it's absolutely stark how you can link the two, how one can link the two. And children with poor vocabulary skills are also twice as likely to be unemployed. Then, talking about the offenders, interestingly, they're often put on courses to try and help them. And these courses are things like anger management and drug rehabilitation. But of course, if they haven't got very good reading, writing and communication skills, it's very difficult for them to actually take full advantage of the courses that they're put on. And so I'm sure you'll agree, Madam Chairman, that none of these things are desirable in a 21st century society. And there's even more to these findings, because many of these children actually come from areas of social disadvantage. There's a very high prevalence amongst vulnerable children and particularly looked after children who have got speech and language and communication needs. And these looked after children, again, are very highly represented in the criminal justice system. 60, as I said, the 60% figure comes out again. Also, excluded children. Not surprisingly, many excluded children are found to have speech, language and communication needs, particularly boys. One study found that excluded boys, of these boys, 100% of them had some sort of communication or behavioural disorder. then not surprisingly, if you look at mums who've just had a baby, who sadly might have mental health issues, which can happen either just before the birth or just afterwards, their growing children have found also to display speech, language and communication needs, probably because the baby didn't get the crucial stimulation it needed that's so important from the absolute outset when you have a baby. So they didn't develop those essential language skills. And that, again, I think highlights, Madam Chairman, how important it is to pick up mental health issues in the mums as early as possible, because it's going to have a knock-on effect on the babes. So this whole parenting issue is really important. So I'm going to talk about that just for a minute. I say digress, but actually I think it is all directly related, because this doesn't only affect people from disadvantaged areas, it does in fact affect all of us, wherever you come from. And it was actually motherhood that prompted my real interest in the importance of early communication. And I'm going here to mention my sister. I may have to register an interest, Madam Chairman, but my sister is herself a speech, language and communication therapist specialising in early years children. And it was she that made me aware of how I ought to be engaging with my babies from the word go. I don't think I'd even held a baby before I had my own children, so I was pretty ignorant. And I'm not saying my children are model success stories, they are not, but I've got to say that the tips I was given really helped. And they were just simple things like this. When your baby is born from 0 to 3, get very close to it, so that the baby has eye contact and the baby knows to start recognising the mouth, and the baby knows that's where sounds come from. If you sit them in front of a telly or a laptop, they're not going to start to realise that. And then at 6 months, baby starts to become very aware of its environment. So start to talk about the things they're looking at. Obviously, they're not speaking, but they are looking. So what one does then is to start naming the thing one thinks they're looking at, whether it's a dog or a cat or a mug or a cup. And then from 9 to 12 months, one can start to expand this. They might be in a high chair, they might be pointing at the cup, so you say the word. But what you do, Madam Chairman, is say it many times, because it's repetition that is how our children learn. And many people, Madam Chairman, think children aren't really communicating until they start talking, but of course they are. They are picking up all those vital signals that are going to help them to start to form words. It's utterly fascinating, and I am told, Madam Chairman, that dummies really are a no-no. And nurseries have borne this out that I've spoken to. A child that has a dummy put in too often, of course this can affect the way that the mouth develops. And I discussed this with a specialist facial consultant who works at Musgrave Park Hospital just recently, and she agreed with me, that you do not want to influence what happens in the mouth, because that's got to grow and develop as well. And I've got to go on now, Madam Chairman, I know it's an area close to your heart, to reading stories and poems and songs. One can never do enough of this with one's children, starting from the word go. And I read recently, there was an article in the paper by author Philip Pullman, really sadly bemoaning the fact that not enough children were read to anymore, and that the bedtime story was disappearing. Indeed, a nursery I visited in Taunton recently said that to me, that many parents were ditching the bedtime story. But of course this is a crucial way of children learning to communicate, and again it's not to do with how wealthy you are or how smart you are. This is a cheap and free, almost free thing that can be done, and it can help our children so much. And actually, interestingly, there's some very good research, Teaching Effective Vocabulary by Miller, which states that at 7, relatively high-performing children with an average of 7,100 words in their repertoire can learn on average 3 words a day. And relatively poor-performing children have on average 3,000 words a day and learn on average 1 word a day. So to catch up when they get to school, this is at early years, when they get to school, to catch up is an enormous gap to fill, and it's almost, I am told on good authority, impossible. And vocabulary at 5 years of age is the best predictor, Madam Chairman, of a child's outcomes at GCSE level. Of course I will give way.
Thank you for giving way, and thank you so much for having such an important debate. Stoke Speaks Out is one of the national exemplars of how to engage. My concern is that there is, and will the Honourable Member agree, that we need sustained funding, because we have seen engagement in this area where 84% of children in my constituency were 12 months behind in oral skills at the age of 2. Heavily invested, did well in their GCSEs, funding was pulled for the next years that come through that follow, and then we saw an exact relationship to their long-term attainment. We need sustained funding for every year so we can break the cycle. Does the Honourable Member agree?
Thank you for your intervention. Of course, a good point is made, and I've heard about that project, and it is an extremely good one. There are some other extremely good projects, and I know that this is on the Minister's agenda, and we are very much... I think this is about joining up the dots, to use some punctuation in this. And we are going to make good progress on this, because it is coming to light, really, how important this really is for society as a whole. And I honestly actually believe on this parenting issue, because parents themselves can do a lot. We can't expect our teachers to have to do it all. They must rightly be able to pick up where they have to. But we must engage society, I believe, on this whole issue. And this is something where I think we could give a lot more pointers to people when they have their children. Many nurseries and primary schools in Taunton Deane, though, to pick up your point, have actually joined with me on this idea that we ought to try and engage our parents to do a little more. So, for example, Tops Nursery at Musgrove Park Hospital, where I visited last week, are really concerned about the number of children arriving at their doors who simply don't have the expected communication skills at whatever their age is. And many of them also are not potty trained, which is a problem, but many also lack basic communication skills that ought to be a given. And they were the ones that mentioned the dummies, you know, please don't use dummies. And they also cited concerns about too many children having been dumped in front of gadgets, you know, so that they're not stimulated and having that human contact that would actually really be considered normal. I also met with a couple of head teachers from two of my really excellent primary schools, one St George's Catholic School and one Trull CVVA Primary. And I happened to mention that I was doing this debate, and both of them just said they've got a marked rise of children starting school who don't talk, who can't hold a conversation, who don't listen, who have speech problems, and therefore have poor social interaction skills. And I actually was quite taken aback, really, that they so quickly came up with this list of issues which clearly our teachers are facing. And this, of course, does put an added burden on our already very hard-working and professional nursery and teaching staff and practitioners. Of course, I'll give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for Taunton and Deane for bringing this very, very important debate. On the points that she is very eloquently putting forward about reasons for delay and factors that inhibit our children, does the Honourable Member agree with me that since it's been 10 years, over 10 years, since the first report and the recommendations made, that now is the time that we should be implementing these recommendations? I have in my constituency a lady who, Helena, she was diagnosed with selective mutism and social anxiety, and it's felt that had she received the support that was needed, she would have been able better now as an adult to contribute to society. However, now she's unable to work, unable to go out alone, and has great difficulty in communicating with people. These recommendations would help address factors such as that. Would she agree?
Thank you. Thank you for that intervention. And of course I agree, and this is very much what we are talking about today, is early intervention. It happens across the board in so many areas, but the earlier we can intervene to prevent an issue escalating, the better it will be for the individual, but also for society and for the economy, because ultimately we're spending less money sorting it out. I actually spoke to one of my constituents, Clifford Mann, who heads up Musgrove Park Hospital A&E, but he's also the National Clinical Advisor for A&E. And although you may not think this is particularly his area, Madam Chairman, he expounded very vociferously about the fact that we need very proactive preschool engagement on this agenda and all others like tackling obesity, because it will pay dividends for the NHS later. So I don't want to be wholly negative, Madam Chairman, because there are already some exceptionally good programmes out there which are doing good work to show that we can actually improve this area. Now, not least the programme that my sister was involved in Herefordshire Health and Care NHS Trust, and this is quoted in the report as a model project. And there are also lots of other very good projects quoted in the report. Time to Talk project in Warwickshire, No Wrong Door project in North Yorkshire, Better Start programme in Southend. And I did want to mention another project, which is in my own constituency of Taunton Deane, called Arrow Tuition, and it's run by Dr. Colin Lane. It's a very good model, working really well, and it's a multi-sensory blend of techniques containing a combination of established and innovative learning strategies with the student's own voice central to the approach. And I think it may be touching on what the Honourable Member mentioned here, the kind of using the voice to help train and encourage, and it really does work. And this gentleman has run a trial project. He's got projects running all over the place, but I suggested that he perhaps go and speak to the Taunton Academy, which has been in a very disadvantaged part of Taunton, and they've got their issues and they're really turning around. I suggested he went to speak to them, and they got in touch with me the other day saying they took on his project and it's working absolute miracles in the school. So I'm going back to present some prizes next week for the children who have made so much progress with their speech and language. So this is children once they're at school. So there are good projects. And Minister, I would really appreciate views on how more of these projects could be harnessed and how we might integrate this very good practice and make the most of it, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We could just engage some more of these projects. However, despite there being clear evidence relating to the huge benefits improving children's communication skills can bring, the second Bercow report highlighted that many parents and carers found it difficult to find help for their children. They weren't sure where to go, and I've got to admit, in trying to find this out in Somerset, I had difficulties myself in finding out where one would go. Waiting times were long when they did get appointments, and many found the support was wanting. So, Madam Chairman, what needs to be done to tackle the clear communications crisis in our children and thereby improve social mobility, health inequality and employment for so many people? Well, there are some pretty straightforward steps, building already on the good foundations that I do believe this government has set in place and is working on. First of all, clear messages from the start, raising awareness of the real difference that addressing this issue could make. Secondly, providing that simple guidance for parents. I'm going to try and put something on my own website, for example. And how about writing to our schools with all parents, people who just had a baby, with ideas and suggestions. I'm sure there are some simple things. But also, as my honourable friend mentioned, training and programmes for practitioners, including health visitors. And our health visitors are so often the ones on the front line who get sent in, but they largely spot the really difficult issues. That's what they deal with. And I spoke to one of my wonderful health visitors, Alison Kalwa, in my constituency recently, and she said, just give me a few more hours and a bit more time and I could make so much difference with this communicating these skills, these language development skills with the mum or the dad and the baby. So I actually raised a lot of these issues, having been to the launch of the Bercow report, with the Prime Minister in a letter. And I was really pleased with the interest she took in her response, and she referenced the Department of Education plans to work with Public Health England to enable health visitors and early practitioners to identify children's SLCN early and put in place the right support. And I'm sure the Minister's going to maybe mention a bit more about this, and I would very much welcome that. So what we need is an overarching strategy with speech, language and communication at its core, with early identification as a key. And I very much welcome the £20 billion just announced additionally for the NHS. And one of the planks of that is mental health. So perhaps here is an opportunity to engage, to harness some of that funding to work on communication issues so that we can prevent people getting mental health issues in the first place. And that's where it would be so important for health providers to perhaps link together and all these public bodies playing their part, Public Health England, NHS England, the Care Quality Commission, NHS Improvement, Ofsted, and the Youth Justice Board, to bring in the members' point there about offenders. And how about including children's speech, language and communication in those sustainability and transformation plans we keep hearing so much about, Minister? Of the 44 sustainability and transformation plans published in 2016, only 3 mentioned this issue. So surely there must be scope there. And perhaps Ofsted inspectors might be trained to ensure children's communication is part of everyday life. But what's overridingly apparent to me is that this issue must be approached jointly by both health and social care and education sectors, even, Madam Chairman, in deciding which minister we might like to come to answer us. It caused a slight dilemma. Should it be education? Should it be health? Who would it be better to raise it with? But I'm very optimistic that this minister will have great links and communication skills, and he will hot-foot it to the Education Department so that they can work jointly. And again, I'd love to hear his views on that. And while I'm at it, I am optimistic that this government can really work on this issue, because it's brilliant that it's all coming to light and so much work's been done on it. I have to put in a bid. One of the things I noticed, and it's an area I particularly work on in Parliament, which is all about the environment, nature and the countryside, is many teachers and nurseries practitioners said how our children adore those forest schools and going outside and communing with nature. And this is a great way to stimulate them and to get their communication skills going. So let's work some of that into it as well. These things should not all be separate, and it's a great way of engaging our children. So to sum up, if communication was given the priorities it deserves, the 1 million+ children that I have mentioned in England who are suffering with problems of communication could be helped. The 7.6% of those whose life chances could be improved is what we should be thinking about. Not addressing this will be a cost to society and the economy. If there are things out there, Madam Chairman, we can do to help, we must try and do them. Because if these issues are addressed, engaging some of the excellent recommendations outlined in the second Bercow report, then look at the wins. There are wins for the individuals, there are wins for society, but there are also wins for the economy as a whole.
Yeah.
Questions that this House has considered speech, language and communication support for children. Preet Kaur-Gill.
Thank you, Ms Doris, and it's a pleasure to see you in the chair. I would like to start by acknowledging the tremendous level of support and activism there has been throughout the country to both raise the profile of the Bercow 10 Years On report and the need to improve speech, language and communication support for children and young people. This support is essential to improve the lives of the over 1.4 million children and young people in the UK who have communication difficulties, too many of whom are not getting the support they need. I also want to welcome the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists who are present here today for all the work they have done. And I also want to put on record my thanks to Gillian Rudd from Birmingham City University, my constituency, for her work on raising awareness on this matter. The petition on Parliament's website regarding the Bercow 10 Years On report has over 10,500 signatures, and this demonstrates a real desire within the public to ensure that support for children and young people with speech, language and communication needs is improved, along with improved support for their families, carers, teachers and other professionals. The nationwide figures are stark. Over 10% of children and young people in the UK, some 1.4 million, have some form of persistent long-term SLCN, and in areas of social disadvantage, up to 50% of children can start school with delayed language or other identified SLCN. Across Birmingham, that translates to over 21,000 children and young people with communication needs, 7.6% of whom will have a developmental language disorder and at least 1% will stammer. These children and young people would likely benefit from long-term support in order to enable them to achieve their full potential. But let us not forget, we are also talking about the need for their parents, carers, teachers, and other professionals to be supported and equipped with the skills they need too. Those who have difficulty with communicating can have problems with understanding and expressing themselves, including social interaction. Imagine for a moment not being able to make yourself understood, not being able to understand what is being said to you, and not being able to make friends or develop positive relationships. It is a truly frightening thought. Left unidentified and unsupported, these difficulties with speech, language and communication can have a huge impact on children and young people's life chances across a wide range of areas. Their educational attainment, behavioural issues, mental health and well-being, health inequalities, employment prospects and interactions with the criminal justice system. Bercow, 10 years on, has demonstrated that more needs to be done to ensure better speech, language and communication support for children and young people who have SLCN. The Minister has written to me outlining some of the things that the government are doing, including focusing on closing the word gap at age 5 and working more closely with Public Health England to support health visitors and early year practitioners. This is a good start, but more needs to be done, particularly for the children and young people who need help beyond the age of 5. Can the Minister confirm what discussions his department has had with the Department of Health and Social Care and with the Ministry of Justice and Youth Justice Board regarding this report? Furthermore, what plan does his department have to extend their proposals to improve identification and support for SLCN for children over the age of 5? And as the Minister knows, I have written to the Prime Minister asking what the Department of Health and Social Care is doing in response to the report, given the need for specialist services. Joint commissioning between education and health and the impact of communication difficulties on mental health and health inequalities is absolutely integral. In separate correspondence with myself, the Minister of State for Care, the Honourable Member for Gosport, said, more needs to be done to ensure that children with a stammer are able to access the communication support they need, and that the Department for Health and Social Care and the Department for Education will be considering what more could be done to strengthen commissioning of communication support. And this interest from the Department of Health and Social Care is encouraging because, as the Minister will know, many children with SLCN are identified initially by health visitors, and as speech and language therapy services are most often commissioned and provided as part of the health system, it is essential that the Department of Health and Social Care plays its full part in responding to the report. And it is only with cross-government action that we can improve the life chances of all children and young people with speech, language and communication needs. Bercow, 10 years on, makes a number of recommendations to improve speech, language and communication support for children and young people, the central of which is a cross-governmental strategy for children with speech, language and communication at its core. And I wish to place on record my support for the recommendations within this report. And with this in mind, will the Minister commit to introducing a cross-government strategy for children with speech, language and communication at its core? And as I come to the end of my remarks, I would also like to ask the Minister when the Government will formally respond to the Bercow 10 years on report. The Prime Minister did commit to responding at Prime Minister's questions on the 21st of March. And finally, I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Taunton Deane for securing this very important debate, and of course the Speaker of the House, the Right Honourable Member for Buckingham, for his leadership in this area. We all recognise just how important communication is to our children, and I look forward to continuing to work with colleagues to ensure that we all play our part in helping to improve the life chances of all children and young people with speech, language and communication needs. If we do not, it is clear that we will be failing the next generation of children and young people. Thank you.
David Duggett.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I also congratulate my honourable friend, the member from Taunton Deane, for securing this very important debate on a very important topic. As soon as I became aware of the topic of this debate, it reminded me that the subject of speech, language and communication needs, you're right, it is a bit of a mouthful, so I'll refer to it as SLCN, is a key factor in supporting patients of a condition that has come to be very close to my heart. I'm the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for a condition called 22q11.2 deletion syndrome. Again, a bit of a mouthful. Sometimes known as the George syndrome, but for the purposes of this speech, I will refer to the condition by the abbreviation 22q. 22q is a not-so-rare but often misdiagnosed and undiagnosed genetic condition, estimated to affect anything from 1 in 4,000 to 1 in 1,000 births. It is the second most common chromosomal disorder after Down syndrome, often described as the most common genetic disorder you've never heard of. In the last APPG meeting I chaired, held only last week, we were fortunate enough to have been joined by clinical experts on the condition from Great Ormond Street. One of these was Dr. Debbie Sell, Principal Speech and Language Therapist at Great Ormond Street, who specialises in speech disorders associated with cleft lip and palate, which are issues very common with 22q, as well as developmental issues. 22q is an excellent example of a condition which exemplifies SLCN. Indeed, speech and language disorders are a hallmark of 22q. Furthermore, given the very high incidence of mental health difficulties in 22q, irrespective of their communication issues, combining this existing risk with the common existence of SLCN makes this group hugely vulnerable. Maximising their speech and language potential is especially important to be able to benefit from non-pharmacological mental health interventions. And children with 22q frequently have developmental challenges in language and speech disorder. Their understanding is often relatively intact, but words and sentences do not come at the expected age. So, for example, 3 to 4-year-olds may only have a handful of words, simple phrases. As preschoolers, they may need to be taught a gesture or signing system to communicate as an alternative means of communication until their verbal language does start to develop. During this period, therapy is essential, addressing attention and listening skills. Basic early communication skills of taking turns, making eye contact, much as my honourable friend described earlier. Helping parents interpret their child's non-verbal communication cues in oral attempts, supporting parents in learning and implementing a gesture system. Once sounds and simple words do start to emerge, therapy changes to developing their vocabulary and their sentence structure. Speech is often severely unintelligible in these cases, with very atypical consonant production, often associated with a problem with the soft palate or the back of the throat. 75% of cases need surgery from cleft lip and palate teams. And surgery to correct this problem is less likely to be successful than for the same surgery in children without 22q, and often more than one surgery is required. However, although surgery will improve the anatomy in order to speak clearly, speech therapy is still required to eliminate the consonant errors. And this is not an overnight or easy task, and often requires intervention over at least 2 to 3 years, and often more. Therapists need expert advice on how to correct these very abnormal articulatory patterns from the cleft team's speech and language therapist, collaborating with the community-based SLT. Unfortunately, we know that accessing intervention is often woefully inadequate and getting more difficult. In 2017, a report on behalf of the Clinical Reference Group for Cleft Lip and Palate for NHS England showed unacceptable inequalities in SLT provision and outcomes across the UK, with large differences in the timing, intensity, regularity and quality of therapy for each child. This report concluded the Bercow 10 Years On report, which I'll refer to later, concluded that therapy provision is a postcode lottery, not based on evidence but costs and demand. Children do respond to intervention, and they can do so well in the resolution of their early speech and language difficulties if they can access help. However, persistent expressive language difficulties and impaired abstract language are common in the school-age years. They particularly struggle when the school curriculum starts to become more abstract. Their language skills involving humour and inferencing, sarcasm can drop off, and their academic skills drop off too. Another problem that's often described to me by my constituents who have children who suffer from a range of conditions often find the frustration exaggerated when school children change from year to year and new teachers have to relearn about the condition. Accessing language therapy at school age is very difficult, and even worse in senior school settings. They start to fail educationally just at a time when their mental health issues can start to kick in. In the last coming up to 13 months since I was elected to this place, I've had several constituents come to me affected by even rarer conditions than 22q, including such genetic disorders as Edwards syndrome, Chard syndrome and others. And in these cases, I, along with the families affected, have been disappointed that clinicians sometimes view these rare cases as the statistical rarity that they represent, rather than treat them as an individual patient in their own right. And finally, I was just going to talk about the Bercow report, as has been mentioned. The report states how poor understanding of and insufficient resourcing for SLCN mean that far too many children and young people receive inadequate, ineffective and inequitable support, impacting on their education, their employability and their mental health, as well as an overrepresentation in the justice system. I would like to take this opportunity today to express support for the recommendations, as others have in the Bercow 10 Years On report. These recommendations are highly relevant to children and young people with 22q, and I would like to highlight how critical it is that the Department of Health and Social Care plays its part in taking these recommendations forward. Thank you.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and thank you for letting me indicate my willingness to speak at such a late stage. Could I start by congratulating the Honourable Lady for Taunton Deane for securing this important debate, but also the tenacity with which she has pursued this issue at pretty much every question time that I've been in the chamber, and she's been able to raise it. And the perspicacity of her speech demonstrates to me that this is something that she clearly has at her heart, and not simply something she's going through because it's able to do so. But I just want to briefly touch on, if I may, the scheme that my honourable friend from Stoke-on-Trent North and Kisgrove raised, which is the Stoke Speaks Out scheme, which was a wonderful scheme that's been running by Janet Cooper and her team now for a number of years. And the purpose of that scheme is to identify at a very early age those young people in Stoke-on-Trent for whom speech and language could be a barrier to their overall development, aspiration and further opportunity. The team at Stoke Speaks Out do wonderful work, but they have the never-ending problem that they constantly have to reinvent the service that they are trying to deliver in order to qualify for new rounds of funding from various different funding agencies and bodies, when the reality is they have a model that works. It has been statistically proven to work, and it has a quantified data set that shows that their interventions cause improvements. In fact, Madam Deputy Chair, the baseline for readiness in Stoke-on-Trent schools in 2016 showed that only 35% of our young people were ahead or on track for speech standards. But after intervention by the Stoke Speaks Out team, that figure by July 2017 had risen to 54%, which I think we'd all agree is a remarkable achievement in such a short period of time for an organisation that was operating on a shoestring. But this isn't, Madam Chair, an issue with our schools. The schools in our city are overall rated good or outstanding. This is a community issue, this is a societal issue, and this is a problem that is often missed. And I think the most pertinent point that the Honourable Lady from Taunton Deane made was about the early interventions outside of those school years. We have a disproportionate number of young people in Stoke-on-Trent for whom the 30 hours nursery provision or preschool arrangement simply isn't available to them because of their work arrangements or because of the thresholds for hours, which means we have a lot of young people who go direct from a home situation into a reception class. And the things that head teachers tell me consistently around the constituency is where young people are not having that nursery provision, that nursery school setting, there is a marked and quantifiable difference between their readiness for speech and language skills as they come into school age 4, had they been through one of the nursery provisions age 3. And the simple fact is that early intervention teams within the community health team are not able to pick up every case where they believe there is somebody that may have a speech and learning development. Indeed, stark statistics suggest that around half of the young people that we have in our constituencies in Stoke-on-Trent North and in South and in my own in Central would be that half of our young people have up to a 12-month delay in their language skills by the age of 3, which, as again, the Honourable Lady pointed out, is a huge impediment on their future success. Schools also talk to me quite readily about the fact that they struggle to get some parents to engage with at-home reading. And that sometimes is down to, in some cases, parents who are not taking the effort, we must be honest about that, but also because of adult literacy rates in some parts of my constituency, meaning that parents don't have the confidence to sit down and read with their children from a very young age. And that again, can cause there to be issues around how is the parenting work. And the Honourable Lady quite rightly points out that the digital corner parent, as we call it in our house, sometimes has a much greater presence in the young person's life than it should do. To the extent that I had one head teacher in one of my schools who said that one of their problems was children coming in with American accents because they're watching American cartoons and TV. So that has become the dominant flavour. So in some of my schools, the word soda and the word elevator are now more commonly used than pop and lift because that is the way that some of the parents are arranging.
Will the Honourable Member give way?
Of course I will.
I hate to interrupt a narrative about American television, but thank you. I thank you for giving way. One of the things that's so important that Stoke Speaks Out has done as the next stage is deliver 3,000 free books to children across our city as part of the Stoke Reads project. Don't you think that this is just as vital for parents as it is for children as they start reading to their children?
I thank my honourable friend for her inevitable intervention. Yes, it was, and she's right. The more we can get parents reading, the better. And actually, my predecessor, Tristram Hunt, did a piece of work with every primary school child in Stoke-on-Trent Centre, where he arranged for them to receive a copy of H.E. Marshall's Our Story of England as they transitioned from primary school to secondary school, so he could be certain that they would have something to read over that summer period. And it's those small things that can go on to developing language skills. There's also a wonderful organisation in Stoke-on-Trent called Beanstalk that arranges for volunteers to go into school and read with children. I believe the Honourable Lady for Stoke-on-Trent's mother is a volunteer with that programme. But whenever I go around schools, I see teachers and head teachers that have used their pupil premium money in very innovative ways to get young people reading and understanding where language comes from. I myself have a 7-year-old daughter, and I must admit I was somewhat confused when she came home having done phonics when she was in her Year 1 class with her oohs and her ahs and lots of new language sounds that I certainly didn't learn when I was at school. But it is clear to me that the new... yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was almost there. But what that demonstrates to me is that there are some wonderful ways in which we can start to tackle this, but it has to be systemic and it has to be continued. So I would like to, if I can, Madam Chair, through you, ask the Minister 3 important points. How does the government see early intervention work continuing, particularly for those young people that are not in nursery provision preschool who... I'm happy to.
Well, just on the subject of different charities doing good work, we do actually have 2 really good charities in my constituency called Read Easy, and they're working with the adults and the adult literacy, because this is an issue, and lots of adults are scared to admit they can't read, but this is a really gentle, lovely way of engaging the adults, because of course they can't help the children if they can't read properly themselves. So just wanted to say that my honourable member makes a very good point.
Thank you, and the Honourable Lady once again is absolutely right with her comments, and the head teachers that I've spoken to in Stoke-on-Trent say once they can get the parents into the school and they can show the parents who may have had quite an unpleasant time at school themselves, the school is a safe environment for them as well as their children, then the engagement levels with the parents increases, then suddenly the homework gets better, the reading diary's filled in, there is more interaction with the school for pastoral and social events, and suddenly the family becomes a much more engaged part of that school community rather than simply dropping their children off and picking them up in the afternoon. But back to my point on early intervention, I'd be grateful for the Minister to explain what the government can do, because it looks like a lot of the future promises of funding will be geared towards schools, and schools are already overstretched. And if we can get those young people before school, we can close that gap and we can ensure that their opportunities for learning are increased. I'd also be grateful to know if the Minister could have at least have some thought to, perhaps not be able to answer today, where does he see this helping with longer-term aspirational plans? Stoke-on-Trent is an opportunity area. We have got 2 wonderful co-chairs in Professor Liz Barnes and Carol Shanahan leading that way, but they again know that early intervention and breaking that cycle early on is important. So how does he see sustainable funding for this? Because the opportunity area is a 3-year programme. They will do what they can in their 3 years, but they will run out after 3 years, and it's how we can embed that into our corporate society. And I'd like to end, Madam Chair, if I can, just by saying to the schools in my constituency, they are working flat out, absolutely flat out, to address this. This is not a debate, I know, about fairer funding arrangements, but anything that the Minister could do to look on schools in areas such as Stoke-on-Trent, where deprivation levels are on every metric higher than we would like them to be, where there might be longer-term intervention programmes for our city as a whole, so that we can make sure that this is not something that the generation of MPs that follow me and my honourable friend are also discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the honourable member for Taunton Deane in securing this important debate. She gave a wonderful speech, very learned, and talked a lot about her own experiences, and I found it really, really interesting. It's really important, I think everyone who's spoken agrees, that it's really important that speech and language is set early on, and how the different ways in which we can do it, and how much that affects children's life chances. It's really, really important for the economy as well, and I also would give credence here to the Bercow report and the 10 years on follow-up report. The honourable member for Taunton Deane really talked to us well about young offenders and how many of them have speech and language difficulties, and we know how important that has to be. We should, and I really enjoyed how she talked about how we should teach our children to speak. I have 3 children, 3 granddaughters as well. I have always talked to my children, and I notice now sometimes that some of my grandchildren, and I'm not pointing fingers, and some of my friends' grandchildren do, as the honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent said, Stoke-on-Trent Central, I believe, said how children are growing up with an American accent, and in some places in Scotland they're growing up with an English accent because and they do, because they listen to English TV, made for England TV programmes, and really children should be speaking their own language, and it makes it much easier for them all round. The honourable member for Birmingham Edgbaston highlighted the problems found across England, and he congratulated the work of the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and I'm glad to see so many of them here today. Yes, and I'll come back to that later. The honourable member for Banff and Buchan, who is the chair of the APPG 22Q, which I have also had dealings with a constituent who left Banff and Buchan and moved to Motherwell and Wishaw, and she has spoken to me at great length about this. I'm unable to help her as much. I will be helping her, but I'm unable to help her as much as I would like, because this is a devolved issue in Scotland. So I signposted her to our local member of the Scottish Parliament so that she can get the kind of help. And some of the stories she's told me, which have been exemplified by the honourable member for Banff and Buchan, are truly heartrending. And language is such an important foundation thing for the whole education process. Again, the honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent Central mentioned 50% of children in his area have up to a 12-month delay in language skills up to 3 years old. And the whole country, the UK, cannot afford to have percentages like that, because it also affects the way of life of these children. It can lead to offending, as we've heard, and it must be addressed. The honourable member also talked about the importance of early intervention, and that is a keystone of Scottish Government policy, is early intervention, because if the First Minister hopes to raise the close the educational attainment gap, then really it's before children go to school that a lot of work needs to be done to help them. It's vital. The Scottish Government believes that speech and language communication support for children is evidence-based and responds to the need of the child. In fact, there's in Scotland, the GIRFEC, Getting It Right for Every Child plan, is Scotland-wide, and it really is the heart of early intervention. NHS, funnily enough, people have talked about the crossover between health and education in this regard. And in Scotland, there's been great progress in that, because NHS Education Scotland have recently announced a new educational resource to help meet speech, language and communication needs. It's an interactive tool that people like, health visitors, and because it's portable, we can take it into family homes and pick up on early on language difficulties and can help the parents and signpost them into where they can get more support and help to help their children and to prevent this gap and delay in language before they start school or indeed nursery. In Scotland also there are many free book schemes for young children at nursery age and in primary one. Again, sometimes if a child brings home a book, the parent is more likely to want to be pestered into, or not want, they will be more pestered into reading to the child, so that also is something that the Minister might look at. In fact, there has been some cooperation between the Dolly Parton and her, I can't even remember, is it the Imagination Books scheme, and they also give out free books. It's vital that children are read to and can learn to read as quickly as possible so that their whole education is much, much more on a sound basis. The Scottish Government also held a communication summit jointly with RCSLT, and that has actually, the work on that was in 2016, and work is still ongoing. The Scottish Government has called for an action plan to support the change and growth of Scotland's speech, language and communication assets, and has asked for key stakeholder support. And actually, in my own constituency, I have knowledge of the Book Bugs Club that are run in Scotland. I don't know if they run in England, but in Scotland, almost all local libraries run book clubs, book bugs classes, where parents with children from as young as 3 months can go along, and they do work with language and singing, and I've actually attended one in Perth with my granddaughter. It's great fun, and I did at one time wonder what was the benefit of this so early on. I mean, she was 6 months old when I took her, but actually it is a great benefit, and it again leads into this whole thing about picking up early on language. I have a wonderful resource in Motherwell and Wishaw, the Wishaw Park at Orchard Primary School. There's a language unit there, and where children go when they have language difficulties on a wide spectrum of language difficulties. Some children need to be taught only in the unit itself, but many are put into the mainstream primary school. And I've had great reports from constituents who have children who are maybe autistic or somewhere on the spectrum, who are then able to go on to a secondary school, completely mainstream, because the language skills have been so much more improved by the use of the unit. The Scottish Government are still working with, I should have mentioned, the Royal College, because they are really helping them to go over the submissions that have been made to try and get this action plan across Scotland to help the development of our young children. So there's a working group, and they're really looking forward to producing this action plan. I'd like to ask the Minister, would he look at what is being done by the Scottish Government and use this as part of the evidence? I find, since I've come to this place, that in Scotland we sometimes do things differently. We don't always do them better, but we do them differently in a number of areas. And there's been a reluctance, I've noticed, sometimes to just look close to home at what's being done north of the border, where it might help and improve the situation. And we're not exclusive, we want to help everybody. You know, it might help children in England as well. So I would really encourage the Minister. And it's really vital that we acquire these, we get our children to acquire these skills. I'm very happy myself to speak to the Minister about anything that he may wish to know. And I know for myself, my own service on the Education Committee, that it doesn't always happen. And really, it's about children. It's about children's chances, life chances. It's about giving them the best possible start in life so that the whole economy can benefit, children can benefit, everyone benefits if we can have this going forward. Thank you.
Emma Lilbuck.
Thank you, Ms Dorries. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Taunton Deane for securing today's debate on this important topic 10 years on from the Bercow report. I want to also pay tribute to Mr Speaker alongside ICANN and the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists for their groundbreaking work in this area, and all honourable friends who've spoken today. Communicating is something many of us take for granted, but imagine being unable to express how you feel, what you think, what you need. A scenario my honourable friend from Birmingham, Edgbaston, so eloquently described. The effects of this can be debilitating and last throughout childhood, adolescence and well into adulthood if left unsupported. I know myself how frustrating this can be. Growing up with dyspraxia, being different and standing out caused me to have chronic low self-esteem and isolate myself from my peers. But of course, I did all right in the end. I ended up in this place. But I would say that's because I got lucky and I had the benefit of being surrounded by, then and now, some phenomenal people. That is why, for the 1.4 million children who struggle with speech, language and communication needs, it is vital the right support is there when they need it. But it isn't. It is lacking and our children are being let down. Let down to the degree that at present 6 children in every classroom do not meet the expected levels of communication and language skills at age 5. Of course, children with speech, language and communication difficulties can access speech therapy and support via a number of avenues: their health visitor, their GP or their school. But this government is presiding over a decline of more than 2,000 health visitors in the last 2 years, fewer GPs in place than in 2015, and our schools are facing the first ever real-term funding cuts in 20 years, with over £2 billion being cut from their budgets. It is little wonder then that the Bercow 10 Years On report highlighted that 73% of parents and carers found it difficult to get help with their child's speech, language and communication needs, and 52% thought their family's experience of speech, language and communication support was poor. The original Bercow report called for early intervention, a point made by my honourable friend from Stoke-on-Trent Central. Early intervention that would prioritise speech, language and communication therapy in Sure Start Children's Centres, 500 of which this government have closed. The report called for strengthening the workforce, but senior and specialist language posts are being lost due to a restructuring of NHS speech and language therapy services. It called for the primary and secondary curriculum to emphasise speech and language communication. Instead, there has been a removal of speaking and listening from the national curriculum, a removal of a judgment of communication from the Ofsted framework, and there is no assessment in spoken language after the age of 5 in the curriculum. 49% of early years practitioners receive little or no initial training in typical speech, language and communication development. The Communications Trust, a large consortium of speech and language and communication skills charities, have seen demand for their services increase by 33% last year alone. But in March this year, we're told by the Department for Education that their contract would be ending. The tender to replace it has no mention at all of speech, language and communication anywhere in it. When the Bercow report 10 years on highlighted that only 15% of survey respondents said speech and language therapy was available as required in their local area, it is little wonder that last year only 234,076 children with speech, language and communication needs actually received any support. There is a pattern here, and it is one of government neglect. This becomes more apparent when children who have additional needs, as well as speech and language difficulties, or access support via education and healthcare plans. The government's hash of these plans is well documented. They were supposed to encourage joined-up planning between healthcare professionals and schools, but in reality this isn't happening. Health is largely cited as being missing from the plans. At least 65,000 children were not moved on to the new plans by the government's own deadline in March this year. A damning report by the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, looking at a large sample of these plans, found many flaws in their execution. A report by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists noted that children without plans were being left completely without support, with just 40% of them saying they had the capacity to deliver services to children without a plan. And 43% stating that speech and language therapy was not being commissioned for the crucial age group of 0 to 2, and those in the age bracket 18 to 25 preparing for work or further education. The Bercow report also revealed that more than half of parents and carers had to wait longer than 6 months for their child to get the help they needed. 6 months is a long time in a child's developmental cycle. My six-year-old constituent, Penny White, has a speech disorder and has been receiving blocks of speech therapy since the age of 3. But she has to wait on average 9 months between blocks. She was also referred to intensive therapy, which has had to wait 3 years for a place. Imagine, Miss Dorries, being Penny's mum Donna and knowing your little girl is just as bright and capable, maybe even more so as everyone else, but is falling behind her peers and her true potential being masked because the support she needs is being withheld by a fragmented system that cares more about the marketisation and profit that can be gleaned from health and education services other than the delivery of them. This government talks a good talk when it comes to social mobility, but the reality is different. In areas of social disadvantage, 50% of children start school with delayed language and communication skills. Children eligible for free school meals are 2.3 times more likely to have language difficulties than their peers. Only 51% of these pupils achieve a good level of development at the end of their early years foundation stage, compared to 69% of their peers. Children with SEND remain stubbornly overrepresented in alternative provision and exclusion figures, with 3/4 of pupils in pupil referral units having special educational needs, and last year alone over 4,000 being left without a school place at all. Some of them are subject to informal exclusions, some are being homeschooled. The fact is this government hasn't bothered to keep track of these children, so we don't know where they are or what support they are getting, if they're getting any at all. I would like Ms Dorries to end on giving a shout out, if you permit me, to some of the non-verbal children who will now be adults that I worked with in the past. They taught me the power of communication. Communication is so much more than words. It can be a smile, a sparkle in the eye, a nod of the head, a hand movement, a laugh or a cry. But what they all had in common was once they had the right support and were able to use words, they were like a different child. One boy I remember in particular transformed from being stoic and withdrawn to a massive chatterbox and the life and soul of his classroom. This is the power of consistent and sustained speech and language therapy, power that is in the gift of the Minister and this government to deliver. The Prime Minister said months ago she would be responding formally to this report. She hasn't. The Minister said a few weeks ago in education questions he was looking closely at recommendations. So today, I have not followed format and asked the Minister any questions because I simply want him to respond to my comments, those of my honourable friends, the report's findings and the recommendations. Because for the children struggling to get by, for my constituent Penny White and my younger self, we at least deserve that.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Ms Dorries. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I thought that the member for South Shields started well by asking us to imagine, as the member for Birmingham Edgbaston has asked us earlier, what it would feel like to be unable to communicate or to explain your own feelings. I don't need to imagine that because I was that child, Ms Dorries. I came to this country with my parents as immigrants in 1978 at the age of 11, and I couldn't speak English. I sat at the back of the class, and initially my teachers thought I had learning difficulties maybe, but within 6 months I picked up the language, and I guess I am the embodiment of what speech and language and communication skills can do for a young child immigrant in this country who couldn't speak the language properly. I do, however, feel that the member of South Shields let herself down by politicising this debate. We've had a very, very good debate today and attempting to weaponise it, whereas many of her colleagues, certainly the member for Stoke-on-Trent Central, spoke eloquently, as did the intervention from his colleague, Stoke-on-Trent North, about the work being done in Stoke speaks out, and of course the opportunity area, which I have to say to both members, the opportunity areas are the best infrastructure I have seen of any government, which have the real chance of working for those disadvantaged communities, because they are bottom up with real targets and real outcomes that are measurable. And my I guess, ambition is to make sure we meet those targets over 3 years, so I can make the argument that we keep going and keep supporting opportunity areas. I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for Taunton Deane on securing this important debate, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to set out the Government's position on supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, including, of course, those, Ms. Dorries, with speech, language and communications needs, SLCN. I am determined that children and young people with SLCN receive the support they need to achieve well in school and independent life. I was pleased to be able to speak at the launch of Bercow 10 years on, and I'm grateful for the work that the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists have done. I can, and of course, Speaker Bercow himself. It was a really good coming together of all the specialists, and I want to put on record that the government will respond formally to the report in due course. I've recently accepted an invitation from the all-party parliamentary group on speech and language difficulties to discuss how we can work together to best support children and young people with SLC, and I hope members here and others will join me there and attend the seminar. Our latest figures show that SLCN is the second most common need for pupils with an education, health and care plan, with 14.3% of pupils having this need. It is also the second most common need for those with SEN support at 22%. I know that Bercow 10 Years On review reports that there is a poor understanding of SLCN and insufficient resourcing for the sector. Many colleagues talked about this. Of course, this is not the government or my expectation. I expect children and young people with SLCN to receive the support they need to help them fulfill their aspirations alongside their peers, and we are taking action to make that a reality. Let me turn to the SEND reforms of 2014. A lot of progress, Ms. Dorries, has been made over the last 10 years since the original Bercow review was carried out. The government has introduced, through the Children and Families Act 2014, the biggest change to the system in a generation. The reforms are about improving the support available to all children and young people with SEND. We're doing this by joining up services for 0 to 25-year-olds across education, health and social care, and by focusing on positive outcomes in terms of education, employment, housing, health and community participation. The move to a more child-centered, child-centric, multi-agency, participative education, health and care needs assessment is improving the support that is available to children and young people with SEND, including those with SLCN. As of the 31st of March, over 236,000 children and young people had their statements of SEN converted to an EHC plan. That equates to 98.4%, I think. This is great news, but we also know there is much more to do. The completion of a statutory transition period to the new system is a great achievement, but it's not the end point for the reforms. We're only part of the way to achieving our vision. The biggest issue we now have to address is changing the culture in local government, clinical commissioning groups, and in education settings. I'm short of time, and I've got a lot to say about the subject, so you'll forgive me if I don't. In terms of supporting schools, let me turn to that. Supporting schools to respond to the needs of all their pupils is crucial to achieving our ultimate goal of culture change. We know that spoken language underpins the development of reading and writing, and the quality and variety of language that pupils hear and speak is vital for developing their vocabulary, grammar, reading and writing. The national curriculum, colleagues mentioned the national curriculum in some of their comments for English reflects the importance of spoken language in pupils' development across the whole curriculum. At primary level, children should be taught to ask relevant questions, articulate and justify answers, arguments and opinions, participate in collaborative conversation, use spoken language to develop understanding, speak audibly and fluently with an increasing command of English. Teachers should ensure the continual development of pupils' confidence and competence in spoken language and listening skills. Having developed these resources and many other relating to other specific impairments, we are now taking a more strategic approach to better supporting the educational workforce and equipping them to deliver high-quality teaching across all types of SEN. We have recently contracted the whole school SEND consortium to enable schools to identify and meet their training needs in relation to SEND, and I'm delighted that the Communication Trust is part of that consortium. Through this work, the whole school SEND consortium will create regional hubs across the country to bring together local SEND practitioners. The hubs will work to encourage schools to prioritise SEND within their continuous professional development and school improvement plans. The resources provide leaders, teachers and practitioners with access to information about evidence-based practice that can be effective for SEN support, including for those with SLCN. In terms of joint work and joint commissioning at local authority level, the duty to commission services jointly is vitally important, Ms. Dorries, to the success of the SEND reforms. We recognise that unless education, health and social care partners work together, we will not see the holistic approach to a child's progression and the positive outcomes that the system aims to achieve. Joint working is one of the best ways of managing pressures on local authority and NHS budgets, looking for more efficient ways to work together, to share information and to avoid duplication will work in favour of professionals and families. Some areas are demonstrating excellent joint working. Wiltshire being an example, they've received very positive feedback on the effectiveness of its local areas joint commissioning arrangement. It was reported that senior officers across education, health and care work together effectively, adopting a well-integrated multi-agency approach to plan and deliver services to children and young people with SEND. We want to learn from those examples. Honourable colleagues, the member for Stoke-on-Trent Central mentioned the evidence that was gathered through Stoke Speaks Out. It troubles me that that particular group of people have to keep reinventing and having to go back for different pots of money rather than us actually looking at that evidence and beginning to scale it for the rest of the country. I will.
Thank you very much for giving way. One of the challenges with Stoke Speaks Out is that in 2006, when it started, they had 30 staff. In 2015, they went down to half a member of staff. Now they've gone back up to nearly 10, and now their funding's being cut again. This level of inconsistency isn't delivering for the children of Stoke-on-Trent.
And I hear the member's point on this. I know she's a great champion for the project. I will pledge to her that I will look at this evidence and see what more we can do to make sure that there is a consistent outcomes going forward. Her colleagues, the member for Stoke-on-Trent Central, talked about early years education. It is fundamental that we identify SLCN as early as possible, as we know this can have profound impact later in life. Children who struggle in language at age 5 are 6 times less likely to reach the expected level in English at age 11 than children who have good language skills at age 5, and 11 times less likely to achieve the expected level in maths. By age 3, most disadvantaged children are, on average, already almost a full year and a half behind their more affluent peers in their early language development. That is also why, for a social mobility perspective, the case to address SLCN in early years is so important. In our Social Mobility Action Plan, Unlocking Talent Fulfilling Potential, we announce our ambition to close the word gap in the early years between disadvantaged children and their peers. Let me just make some progress on this, and I think we might be all right on time, and I will give way to Honourable Lady. We announced a range of measures, over 100 million to address this, including 20 million, Ms Dorries, in school-led professional development for early years practitioners to support early language development, and 5 million on What Works Fund in partnership with the Education Endowment Foundation. The evidence is clear that parents have a crucial role to play in this area. The study of early years education and development, the SEED study, impacted age 3 reports, showed that aside from maternal education, the home learning environment is the single biggest influence on a child's vocabulary at age 3. We'll be investing £5 million to trial evidence-based home learning environment programmes in the north of England. On the 1st of July, we launched a £6.5 million fund inviting voluntary and community sector organisations to bid for grants to run projects that help disadvantaged families and children with additional needs improve children's early language and literacy skills. Local authorities sit at the centre of a wide range of services and workforces which make a big difference to SLCN. We will be working with local authorities through a peer support and challenge programme to deliver better early language outcomes for disadvantaged children, learning from the best evidence so that we can then scale. We will also be publishing an early years dashboard which will show local authorities' performance in early years outcomes with a focus on disadvantaged children and early language and literacy. We recognise the important links between a child's early health and development and their later educational outcomes. That is why we have formed a partnership with Public Health England, which my honourable friend, the member for Taunton Deane, mentioned, and the Department for Health and Social Care to improve early language outcomes for disadvantaged children. In May of this year, Public Health England launched a call for good local practice and pathway examples. They're holding a workshop today in London where they will set out the key components of a model speech, language and communication needs pathway built on the best evidence and experience of implementation in practice. These resources will provide health visitors with additional tools and training to identify and support children's SLCN to ensure that the right support is put in place early. Let me just turn to the mental health green paper. Mental health was another key feature of the Bercow 10 Years On report. It highlights the links between SLCN and mental health issues and made a number of recommendations about how the green paper proposals could make links with SLCN provision. On the 4th of December of last year, the government published a green paper transforming children and young people's mental health provision. The consultation closed on the 2nd of March, and we are currently considering responses and will issue a formal response in due course. The green paper creates some clear expectations about the changes every area should be seeking to achieve to improve activity on prevention, better partnership working between children and young people's mental health services and schools, and improve access to specialist support. As part of this, Ms Dorries, we are incentivising every school and college to train a designated senior lead in school for mental health, to coordinate a whole school approach to mental health and well-being. We expect the designated senior leads to liaise with speech and language therapists to ensure children with SLCN receive the help they need. Let me turn to the work. I'll give way.
Thank the Minister for eventually giving way. Ms Dorries, the Minister said that I was letting myself down, making this issue political. I would respectfully say that he is letting myself and other honourable members down. I listed a litany of failures of this government towards children with speech and language and communication needs, and not once... And not once has the Minister responded with anything practical. It's all in the future. We will. What about now? It's urgent.
Of course, absolutely. The Department of Health and Social Care recognises the need to support children and young people with SLCN who are in the justice system. Liaison and diversion L&D services at police stations and courts identify and assess people with vulnerabilities and refer them onto appropriate services, and where appropriate, away from the justice system altogether. On completion of a tracked care plan is undertaken for all children, setting out their needs and provision of health services. Where this relates to mental health or neurodisability need, all sites have access to the full range of comprehensive child and adolescent mental health provision, including child psychiatrists and psychologists, specialist nurses, occupational therapists, and speech and language therapists. In conclusion, Ms. Dorries, I want to address the member for Motherwell and Wiltshire's point about the devolved government. I am more than happy to come up and learn and share good practice between what we are doing in England and, of course, what the Scottish Government is undertaking. The member for Banff and Buchan mentioned a very, in many ways, niche chromosomal deficiency, 22q11. I'm very happy to take this offline with him to understand a little bit better. And I already work very closely with my colleagues in the Department of Health to raise this issue of practitioners treating this as sort of statistical outliers rather than real children with real families. So I will take that on board as well. I'm very grateful for the support that honourable members have given to this agenda, Ms. Dorries. My honourable friend for Taunton Deane has raised some important concerns, and I hope that she is happy with the update that I have provided. The steps that have been taken by government show the importance of SLCN, and we remain firmly committed, as I hope I've demonstrated, with a real strategy, real funding, and real commitment to ensuring that children and young people with SLCN receive the support they need. I would like to thank you again for inviting me to speak to you and to look forward to seeing some of the colleagues here at the APPG on speech and language therapy. I think I can give the member for Taunton Deane a little longer than 1 minute to sum up. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Dorries.
Ms. Rebecca Pow.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister. And in particular, Minister, for sharing your own experiences of, I had no idea actually that you couldn't speak English until you were 11, so I think that's quite remarkable how far one can go, and also your clear passion, which I hope is going to stand us in good stead to answer some of those questions that have been raised today, and that we can work together. I also did really want to thank all the members who have taken part, from Banff and Buchan, Horsham, and the honourable members from Stoke Central, which had a very good showing today, and Stoke North, yes, and also from Birmingham and Edgbaston. I think there's a great deal of interest in this area. But I hope what this has highlighted today, Madam Chair, is there are just far too many children with speech, language and communication disorders, and this does affect their life chances. Too many of them end up with mental health issues, end up being excluded from school, end up in that list of young offenders, and ultimately many of them end up being unemployed, and this is really not good enough, and we ought to be able to address it. But what I think today is highlighted, and the Bercow report has highlighted, and indeed many of the excellent people who are watching today can highlight and demonstrate, is it doesn't have to be like this. And there's already a great deal of excellent work in progress, as the Minister has outlined, and much in the pipeline. And I get the feeling from speaking to him and from today that he is committed to improving this, and actually there are some quite simple steps that could improve it. And I was very pleased to hear that there's going to be a particular concentration on that joint working and joint commissioning of services between health and education, which was one of the particular things that I did want to make sure came out of this debate. But also I think it's very important that continuity of programmes, of good projects, because I do know, especially from my sister's own input, about this awful drama and actually time wasting of having to keep reapplying for funding when you've already got a really good thing going, Minister. You know, and it's actually a waste of time and everybody's effort, and perhaps we could try and smooth that out a little bit. And please, the all-important issue of parenting. I've touched on that because it isn't only about those very disadvantaged people, it's actually about everybody. And if we could help engage a little bit more on that front, I think we could make huge progress together. I'm optimistic that this can all change, and I'm also really optimistic that with the Minister's commitment and the Department, and the Department of Health that we really, really can make this change. I hope we will, and I'm confident that this will happen. So thank you, Madam Chair, and for being part of the debate.
Order, order. The question is that this House has considered speech, language and communication support for children. As many of that opinion say aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.